Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining me. I appreciate your time and attention. My name is Robert Rodriguez Jr., and I'm a professional landscape photographer, printmaker, teacher. I'm also honored to be and have been a Canson Infinity Ambassador since 2011. So on behalf of Canson Infinity, um, I welcome you here, and I'll be sharing this presentation today titled From Capture to Print, a Creative Process. Basically, I'll be sharing the steps, more precisely the mindset, the sort of the thinking that I go through when I'm developing an initial idea into a finished piece of work. And in this case, we're talking about a fine art print. There'll be some time at the end for questions, of course. In the GoToWebinar interface there, you'll see an area there where you can enter your questions. I'll try to answer as many as I can towards the end. As I said, I'll pause at the end for a specific Q&A. If I see something pop up and I have time to answer it, I will, but generally speaking, I like to kind of get through all the questions at the end so I don't break my train of thought, if you will. Just a little bit of background about myself so you know where I'm coming from and sort of where I'm getting the knowledge that I'm going to be sharing. I've been selling my work as fine art prints in galleries and art shows, corporate environments for over 15 years. I've done lots of local environmental photography for land preservation, which is really true and dear to my heart. I've been teaching photography and printing for 10 plus years, many different levels, field workshops, studio workshops, photography clubs, trade shows, pretty much any place where we can gather and talk and learn about photography. I draw on all of this to present and share what has worked for me. So I'm not saying that this is the only way to approach this, but it's definitely worked for me in terms of not getting to a goal, but helping me to progress, to keep growing creatively, to stay motivated and inspired, to keep growing, right? To keep me curious. And I think that's the most important thing. We're always looking forward to new areas, new plateaus, if you will, new peaks. So to get started, that's what I want to share. I want to share the basically guiding principles that I think can help you increase your creative potential, to grow as a photographer, to grow as a printmaker, of course, whether you've been printing for a while or you're just getting started. The reason for this is because I think that having principles is really important, particularly very basic, or what I would call first principles. And so, for example, the most important part of making a print is not the technical aspects of the paper. It's your composition. It's your original image. That's what's going to then proceed down this path to wind up as a print. But the print is only going to be as strong as the initial idea and your realization of that idea as a photograph. So I want to present this as a creative process rather than, as I said, a formula or a set of rigid steps. So the first guiding principle I want to share is having clarity about what and why. So this is based on a very simple but important question, right? What am I photographing and why am I photographing it? Or more broadly asking yourself, what do I want to say and why do I want to share it with others? This is really important. I can't really overemphasize how important this is to constantly ask yourself this question particularly when you're out in the field. This will help you to become more intentional, more purposeful about your camera gear, about your editing decisions, your paper selection, and especially your subject or your theme, the story you're trying to tell. Right? That story is not so much about the actual thing in your picture, but it's about the interpretation of that thing, what you as the photographer find captivating, your emotional response. So constantly asking yourself what and why, right? For me, being clear in my mind about what I was trying to capture helped me in progressing, from this initial idea to what I really had in my mind, the essence of what I was responding to, the what and the why that I mentioned before. Being clear about why you find something interesting lets you become more curious, right? Maybe curious about a few trees receiving some light. I could have easily walked past this towards the grand vista, so to speak, but I was more interested in something more intimate. That's how I was feeling that day, or that's kind of what I was seeing. And so it allowed me to kind of explore that. But I had a sense of what I wanted to achieve, or a sense of at least what I was becoming aware of, what I was feeling inside. The second guiding principle is compositional strength. I've talked about this in the past a lot. I've done classes, webinars, but because I still think that this remains the biggest challenge and the biggest area for growth for any photographer. Compositional strength is important because, as you already know, right, the capability to make, let's say, a technically perfect image, particularly if you use your camera in automatic, right? If you were to do that, it's really simple these days. Cameras can, they're fantastically advanced. The quality of lenses available to everyone is there. The quality of the cameras is there. We're not talking about megapixels anymore. The technology has gotten to the point now where you can really, really make nice captures with, a little bit of basic understanding. And that's pretty much available to everyone. But that doesn't get you to an expressive piece of work. For that, you also need the art, the emotional content of the image that you want to convey to the viewer. The only way to get to expression or art, specifically art like this, is to realize that the subject or location is not necessarily what energizes the viewer. What energizes the viewer is what you say about the subject or location. So whether you're a photographer or a painter, you're still using the same visual language, and it's really about the emotional content that you want to bring across. And that's where the emotion lies. It relies, this compositional framework relies on, right, time-tested principles of visual design of composition. And that's this language that we really need to understand, that I think is critical to, once again, going beyond just a mere capture, but putting you and your unique way of seeing into an image. Now, another reason to emphasize design and composition over subject or location is that it provides a much better foundation to critique your own work, right? If you're looking at your own images and you're trying to decide where can I grow, where am I lacking, what's working, what's not working, it's a lot stronger. You're in a much better place when you understand compositional principles, because that is the language, and you can tell when the language of your photograph is working better and when it isn't working better, versus saying, oh, that's a nice picture of this place, that's not so nice a picture of that place. And you're just looking at places instead of what is underlying the location. So you go from just simply looking at things to focus on what really makes an image work, that underlying design. And that's really powerful. Now, I'm not going to get too far into composition. That would be a whole different subject, but I, generally speaking, rely on this basic compositional framework, which is three kind of ideas. One is make sure you're leading the viewer through your image. You're creating a sense of direction, where the viewer should be looking and how they're going to get there. The second aspect is having a fairly defined center of interest. That could be a thing, that could also be a mood or a feel, an atmosphere, atmosphere that you're trying to capture in the scene and the atmosphere that you're feeling. And the third thing is that in your frame, everything should feel like it belongs, right? It's harmonious, it's unified. And I title this LCU. Every time I'm looking at my own images or helping a student with other images, I'm thinking about these things, because if you can get these three things working really well, that will definitely give you the foundation for a strong, visually appealing composition that will keep the viewer interested. Okay, so just something to keep in mind, something to explore in the future. The third guiding principle is, and again, we're progressing towards making prints, is what I call creative developing. I'm using the word developing because I use Lightroom, and so Lightroom has the develop module, and that's where we do our editing. If you're not using Lightroom, it's the editing stage that I'm talking about. But in the creative developing stage, we're both optimizing and interpreting the image. We're optimizing it for things like optimizing the tonal range of your raw file. We're optimizing for sharpening. We're optimizing to get the right colors and the right separation between different things. And then we move into interpretation, which has more to do with strengthening the compositional principles that you started in terms of when you captured the image. We do that through local adjustments like dodging and burning, graduated filters, things like that. But we're basically enhancing or improving the compositional elements that will help the viewer get a much better understanding, a much clearer picture of what it is that the image is about. And all of this is done again in the creative, in the developing stage. And so that's quite important. And having a compositional framework means that you're not like sort of lost in what adjustments you're going to use, but you have a much more intentional way of using the adjustments and knowing what you want to do to the file. It gives you a sort of a guide, if you will, versus not really knowing how to edit the image or not quite sure what's actually working or not. So here, as an example, is my original capture as a raw file, and here is the edited stage or the finished stage. And you can see that I've done quite a few things to the image to emphasize the things that I thought were most important, particularly the colors and the depth and sort of the drama of the scene. Here's another image where this was my original capture, but in my mind already I was thinking something a little more abstract, and so the final version is a black and white because I wanted something that was more abstract, a little more dreamy-like, if you will, and taking the colors away really just let the sense of the tones work a little bit better. Here's another example where if you start with good composition and good design, then my initial capture doesn't need a lot done to it to get to the final version, because everything that I really wanted in the image was there to begin with. So I didn't have to do a whole lot of editing to it. Again, the editing is not where you add anything to the image. You're complementing, you're enhancing what's already been, what you've already done in the field with your camera, right? So even if it's as simple as this, right? As long as it answers that why question, why are you photographing this? Then you know that you're progressing, that you're staying true to your vision. The last guiding principle is once you're ready to commit that vision to paper, right, to a print, then it's paper selection, right? Choosing a paper that adds to the equation and using the paper's aesthetic characteristics to complement that vision. And this is, again, very important because you really want to think about your print as separate from your image on screen. It is a separate thing. It is a physical thing that exists in reality versus an image that is represented on a screen in using pixels, using electronic in electronic form. A piece of paper is reflected light, right? And so it's a totally different interaction for yourself and for your viewer who's looking at the print. Now, I'm assuming that all of you who are here want to print and have a good sense of why you want to print, but I'd like to go over just some basic ideas about why I think printing is amazing, why I love printing, and have been printing since day one as a photographer. I mentioned that it adds that physical, tactile experience to essentially digital photography, right? Something that is it's experienced digitally, whether it's in your camera and then on your computer screen, on an iPad, or an iPhone. Well, this is a tactile thing, and I can tell you, and all of you who have shared your prints with others, there's a certain response and a certain attention that people give to a print that you just won't get with an iPad screen, for example. It also gives you more opportunities for interpretation because, as I said, you can complement an image with a particular paper or substrate, and that creates sort of a new version of that piece of work. You can experiment with that and see different papers and kind of how they shift the impression of the image. And I also think it creates a deeper connection for your work, right? Because I know that I can look at 20 images on my screen, and yet if I have a print on my table, there's something about that print that just holds a little more weight for me. Assuming that, it's a print that I like, it just has some physicality that just feels much more real to me than something that's on a screen. Now, I'm not suggesting that you make a print of every image you capture, right? Just those that you feel you can learn from, right? They don't have to be images that are your best. Images that you want to learn from, images that you want to see how they would translate to paper, and that gives you a sense of how a print is interpreting your work and also the adjustments you're making, the papers you're choosing, all of that helps to kind of improve your knowledge base about all the little things that go into that final piece of work that comes out of the printer. So let me get a little bit into paper selection. This is a deep, not only is it a very kind of a deep topic, but I'm sharing this with you, electronically through a monitor. It's not going to be anything like actually holding or feeling the paper in your hand. So, in a way, I would say that what I'm saying is probably more important than what you see on screen, because I'm going to try to explain or describe, these physical properties. But everything I've been discussing so far rests on a specific approach to using papers. So I want to spend some time on this, right? So you could think of two different ways to choosing paper. We can call one, or I call one, the paper-centric approach, right? In a paper-centric approach, you basically look at lots of different papers from Canson or maybe some other manufacturer, and then you kind of figure out which ones you like the best for some reason, and then you pick that paper, you select that paper, you buy that paper, and that kind of implies that most of your images will be printed on that type of paper. And that's, as I said, a paper-centric approach. You're starting with the paper. The other approach, the one that I prefer, I'm not saying that it's necessarily better, but I think I can make an argument why I think it will give you more options, more creative options, and even more satisfaction in your printing, is an image-centric approach. And so in the image-centric approach, right, instead of finding one paper that works for the majority of your images, or even which paper is best, for black and white or for landscapes. Probably the most common question I get is what paper is best for black and white. That would be the paper-centric approach. In the image-centric approach, you evaluate each image or your body of images, because none of us really have, very few of us have images that span every sort of genre. We tend to stay in particular genres. You evaluate each image based on what you're trying to convey, and you choose a paper that best complements or strengthens that particular vision. This allows you to be more creative, right? More unique with your prints, and you use the qualities that particularly that a great paper can add to your images, that can add and create a print that is unique and is satisfying and kind of stands on its own. Now, this doesn't mean, by the way, that, for example, in my case, that I select from every, that I'm evaluating every single Canson paper that's available. And the reason for that is because, as I said before, I tend to stick to a few genres, nature, landscape. That's more or less where I'm doing the majority of my work. And there are some papers that generally don't complement the style of images that I make. So heavily textured papers, super glossy papers. For me, and what I'm trying to accomplish, those papers don't work for me, or they don't work as well as others. And so I tend to exclude those. So I tend to select from a more limited collection of papers that do tend to work with my images, depending on what I'm trying to say, or trying to convey in the image. There are some papers, as I said, that work for me over and over again. And so I got to know these papers, like, for example, like go-to lenses, right? You kind of know which lenses work best for what you're trying to do, and then you kind of go back to those lenses. You don't have to go to a lens that isn't going to be quite up to the task for what you're trying to do. And I use these papers for the strengths and for the weaknesses. Now, don't read the exact papers that I have here, because this is a kind of an older graphic, and there are newer papers now that I have been using, because I find that they're even better than what I was using before. If a paper-centric approach works for you, if you just like having one paper, then great, right? Like I'm not an absolute kind of person, but given that we have this amazing variety of papers today, we're kind of fortunate in that. That hasn't always been the case. And we also have amazing printers where we don't really have to worry about the printer being able to print on many different kinds of papers. And that, again, wasn't something available to generations of photographers before. In a way, I kind of think it's an artistic privilege that we consider how and why to use these tools to express ourselves creatively. If you're going to indulge in this, if you're going to enjoy this, if you're going to get creative fulfillment from it, then I think it's worth exploring these options. So in order for you to make the creative decision about what paper might work best, you need to have some basic understanding of paper characteristics. How do I know what the paper does or what it's going to look like or what it's going to feel like, and how do I make that work with my image. And so that's what I'm going to talk about now. The most important element in paper is the coating. Okay, there are other parts of the paper like the base and what the paper is made of and all that, but for the purposes of today, where we're kind of limited on time, the coating really determines what you see and the translation that you're going to get through printing from your image. The paper surface determines the density, and density is the amount of black that a paper can hold. It's also called Dmax. It determines the texture, the reflectivity, how shiny or not the paper is, and also the look and feel of the paper. The look and feel is more or less, the impression that you get, the aesthetic impression. As I said, the surface of the paper gives you the Dmax. Dmax is incredibly important because that determines how much black a paper can hold, and the more black a paper can hold, the greater dynamic range you have. And the higher the black density, the richer the shadows, the more contrast the printed image will exhibit, okay? And as I said, this is important from an analytical standpoint because you can measure these things, but more so aesthetically, okay? Aesthetically, the higher the contrast, not only makes a print look more vivid, but it also makes it feel louder, more aggressive, right? More in your face. And so that's what a paper that has a higher density does, higher contrast, higher dynamic range. Now, this is perhaps the most important thing I'm going to say about paper selection, in that this is neither a good nor a bad thing, okay? This is not to say that louder is better, is not to say that higher Dmax is better, is not to say that more aggressive is better. These are just qualities. It's a tool that you can use when considering which paper is best for your image. As I said, louder doesn't mean it's better. Sometimes you want an image, a print that is softer, right? That is, in a sense, smoother. Maybe you want a silhouette that's not so strong, not so overbearing. You want to convey something quiet about a moment in time or nature. So again, these refer to the perception of the image and what you want to convey as a photographer, right? This is what I've been talking about, vision, and asking yourself what and why and all those things, because all of these questions and all of these ideas lead towards choosing a paper. So it's not about what the subject is, it's about what you want the viewer to see. Now, let me share some basic paper principles, right? The first one is that the most visible difference between papers, okay, the single biggest difference that you're going to have between two papers is the Dmax, okay, or the density level of the paper. Let me just let my dog in because she is upset that I'm excluding her from here. So give me 1 second, sorry. All right, sorry about that. Folks, if you have a dog, you know what that's like, but she likes photography, so that's all good. Okay, so as I said, the single biggest difference between papers is going to be the density level. That is going to be the biggest difference that you're going to see, a paper that's either low Dmax or high Dmax. And again, that you can kind of think of that as a volume. The second most important principle is that all matte papers, okay, all matte papers have a lower Dmax rating than a non-matte paper. So a non-matte paper is going to be anything like, luster, satin, semi-gloss, gloss, Baryta, fiber. Any paper that doesn't have the name matte in it is going to be a non-matte paper, and it's going to have a higher Dmax rating. Again, matte papers have a lower Dmax rating, meaning that they're going to have a more limited dynamic range, okay? Now, a little caveat to that might change, as there are some paper, this particular paper now from Canson, which I'll mention later, that is a matte paper, but has an amazing finish where we're almost approaching now Dmax levels that you would only get on a non-matte paper. But generally speaking, you can kind of use that as a rule of thumb, which is matte papers, less contrast. And then finally, texture, which you really only get in matte papers. Texture in varying amounts, you can use that to add dimension to textures that are already present in the image, or at least that's how I like to use texture. I have a lot of texture in an image, then having texture in the paper can sort of complement that and add a little extra dimension. And I'll show you some examples of that as well. Okay, what's going on here? Okay. So as I said, matte papers, lower Dmax relative to fiber and glass. They have a more defined surface textures. They have more of a fine art look and feel. Okay, it imparts more of a painterly look. So here's an image that I printed on a matte paper because even though there's a lot of detail and texture in it, I really wanted, there's a lot of texture in the image itself. I wanted to capture that texture in the print. And so I chose a paper that had a fair amount of texture to really add that sense of depth and dimension. Okay, and contrary to what some people think, matte papers, at least matte papers from Canson, do not reduce the detail of an image in any way. You're not losing any detail when you print onto a matte paper, and this is really important because it means that you can choose a paper based on just aesthetic qualities, and you don't have to worry so much about compromising detail as an example. Okay, it is true that you'll get maybe more perceived detail on a luster paper. That's just because you're getting a little bit more contrast. But for me, that's not enough of a reason to use a non-matte paper, because what I get from a matte paper in other different ways, again, the texture, the softness of it, more of the painterly look, it really outweighs perhaps that sheen that you would have on a non-matte paper. So I print finely detailed landscape images all the time on matte papers. And, I'm amazed at how well they hold up with things like fine grasses, snow, textures, things like that, okay? The lower contrast of a matte paper as compared to luster or gloss, for me, is also one of its strengths, right? When you need that subtlety, when you need nuance, right? Less is more, as they say. A print that doesn't like jump out at you, but has more of a suggestive quality to it. I think that's what I really like most about matte papers. They give a less photographic look to your image, and again, that can impart kind of a painterly look. Again, it's not just enough to say that you want a painterly look. You also have to have an image that complements that, so they work well together, so they work hand in hand, right? You can use matte papers for any type of image, black and white, HDR, whatever. Again, it depends on the look and feel that you want to have in the image. And there's no right or wrong choice necessarily. Again, it depends on what you're trying to interpret. The next major category of papers, which again are the non-matte papers, and that is this big category of papers that we also find papers called like luster, satin, fiber, gloss, whatever, any of those categories. And they tend to have higher Dmax. They don't have the same amount of texture that matte papers will have. The paper surface is generally a little bit whiter because they have a shinier surface, and they also have more of a photographic look and feel. They look more photographic, not as painterly, you could say. And again, the biggest difference is the Dmax that these papers can hold. So when you want high contrast, you want a more photographic look, something that's very aggressive, something that holds black incredibly well, tonal separation in the shadows, for example, not just shadows, but having lots of tonal separation in the shadows. That's when a high Dmax paper like Platine Fiber Rag, like Baryta Photographique, is going to be probably better to give you that separation, right? To complement that from the image. As I said, Platine and Baryta are a category of papers called fiber papers, right? And these are papers that are designed to kind of emulate traditional darkroom prints that were called Platine and Baryta, right? And they tend to have a very smooth, silky finish, right? They look great. They look great when you see them, and they have that nice pop and punch. Here I'm using the paper Platine in a way to really bring across the illusion of wet rocks, right? That reflectivity, the shininess of the rock comes across a lot better when I have a paper that has a sheen on the surface. This is a luster paper, but definitely has more of that effect than I would have gotten using a matte paper. Matte papers, by the way, exhibit a completely different look and feel, right? They tend to make an image less literal, right? Less photographic, right? So hence we make that comparison to painting. When I say, when we say that a print is softer, more symbolic, more suggestive, it's due to the use of a matte paper. And you can see that this image has more of those soft kind of ephemeral qualities, and that's why a matte paper for me here is ideal, right? So that's how I'm kind of thinking in my mind about what the paper is going to do to the image and what the image really, what I want the image to really convey. So the key point here is to consider all of the factors that make an image successful, right, for you, and then choose a paper accordingly. So here I have, a black and white image that has lots of shadows, it has darks, but I'm not trying to convey something that is loud or aggressive or that pops. I want something here that is much more softer, right? That's the feel here. It was a quiet morning, in fog, trees transitioning in this fog, and it was more about this sort of this very quiet, serene moment. A high Dmax paper would have emphasized much more of the trees because that's where the darks are. Whereas I wanted the context of the whole scene, therefore I used the matte paper. The matte paper would soften things a bit and place the trees more in the scene versus bringing them out into the foreground. And you could say, well, I can use, you might say to yourself, I can use a high Dmax paper, but when I when I edit it, I'm going to reduce the blacks so that I get that softer look on the matte paper. And yes, you could do that. But the problem with that is, again, you're missing out on the surface itself. The surface of a matte paper doesn't reflect the light the way a, let's say a platine paper does, or high density paper does. It disperses the light more. So even before you put any image on a matte paper, the paper already has a kind of a softer feel to it. Plus you have the texture component of it. It doesn't reflect light the way a high Dmax paper will. So the inherent qualities of the paper already are going to suggest a certain feel. And that's why I think that if you want that feel, the paper, going to a paper is going to give you much better results versus trying to sort of emulate that in the editing stage. The texture of a paper can add a lot of dimension to a print. Texture is kind of a physical irregularity on the surface of the paper. And so that can blend in with areas in an image that have texture. As you can see here, this is an example where, the texture of the paper really complements the print, and it really makes the text, the feel of the image stand out much more. All right, so generally speaking, you want the texture to complement texture that you have in the image, and the two things combined together sort of create a single statement, all right, in a finished print. So once you start to think about papers as an aesthetic sort of combination of the paper and the image, right, you'll have a much better sense of, I think, you'll start to gain a sense. Of course, this is going to take practice, but you'll gain a better sense of which paper is going to be best for your image. So let's consider just a few examples from an image standpoint. Okay, here's an urban architectural scene, lots of detail, flat reflective surfaces, very shiny, smooth metal, concrete, etc., no sky. For me, a fiber paper, which is a high Dmax paper, would work well here because the fiber paper is going to retain the subtle shadow separation, the slight variation in tones between the buildings and the bottom and the top, right? And it's also going to make the image much more graphic, much more photographic, much more punchy. And that's what I'm looking for here. This is the impression that I got standing in front of these buildings. I just felt their physicality. A high Dmax paper like a platine fiber rag works really great for an image like this. It complements the story of the image. Here's another example, which much different than the previous one, right? This is totally, of course, this is totally in terms of my vision for the image. So we each have to decide what the image is about, which is why I can't tell you what to do for your image. You have to kind of decide what is it that you want to convey in the picture. But for me, this image is much more organic. The shadows, I don't need a lot of shadow separation. I've got a lot of separation already between the colors and the shapes and the sky and the ground. The darks are really just there as a way to kind of give the impression of light. And so for me, I'm using a matte paper here, probably something like BFK Reeves, which is a beautiful paper with just a subtle texture, because there's tons of texture in the image. And what you want is you want the viewer to simply enjoy it, appreciate it. If you're lucky enough, they get carried away or carried into the scene without knowing why. I mean, that's when your art is really working, when the viewer just enjoys it and they really get a sense, a feel, an emotion from it. This is another great example about thinking about volume as a starting point, right? I don't want this image to be loud. It's not about loudness. Yes, I have lots of shadow areas, but again, I want it to be softer. There's something about the light and the light kind of streaming in through, the haze and just sort of lighting up the tops of these little hills. And so again, for this, I used the matte paper because a high Dmax paper would have emphasized those shadows and I think made it more about the mountains, where it's more about just sort of this repetitive pattern that I had in the image. It's more graphic, it's more about the composition. And so that's why a matte paper here with less density gives me sort of the feel that I want, the more of a suggestive kind of painterly look to the image. And the dimension of the texture that I used in this image also adds that extra bit of dimension. So let me show you some capture to print examples, right? So here I'm going to just show you from my original capture how I developed it and then how I printed it. So here's an image from Death Valley. This is the original capture without any editing done to it. I'm sharing some technical details here about the image just in case you're interested. Nothing really unordinary here, 24 millimeters, no filters, f11 to give me nice depth of field. I love making prints when I can add the least amount of sharpening in Lightroom, because if I really capture it sharp in the field, that sharpness really comes through in the print in a way that you don't get if you're adding sharpening. When you add a lot of sharpening, when you have to add a lot of sharpening, there's a certain crispiness or grittiness or kind of digital feel that you get. Whereas if you can get an image to be really sharp in the field by optimizing both your aperture, using the sweet spot of the lens, if you will, and also making sure you're on a tripod and you have zero movement, that sharpness comes through. So that's the original, and then this is the finished edited version. And you can see from a compositional standpoint that what I'm doing is emphasizing those grasses in the foreground and sort of the repetition of the grasses as they build. Where's my pointer here? Well, can't get it now. As they build from the foreground to the midground and then up into the sky. This image I printed on a paper called Arsh BFK Reeves, pure white. So there are two versions of BFK Reeves. One is white and one is pure white. The pure white paper has a little bit of a higher white point. It's a little bit whiter, and I tend to like that one because it gives you more dynamic range on a matte paper, which is always good. And I always use the heaviest grade paper from Canson, which is 310 GSM. I like the heavier papers, the heavier weight, because it's more substantial. They're less likely to curl up if you frame them. They feel better in your hand. They're just more robust, if you will. And so I like kind of that heavier paper, and the cost difference is very, very small. So I went on BFK Reeves because this image, the textural quality of the image for me is one of the most important things. Also, I have texture in the sky. All of it has a lot of texture throughout. Plus, once again, it's not a loud image per se. It's not something that needs deep, dark shadows. It's more about having enough information to lead the viewer in from front to the back. Just also try not to judge too much the way the print looks on your screen, because again, this is a photograph of a print that I'm sending over the internet. So it's very hard to really give you a sense. As much as I tried to edit them as carefully as possible, it's never going to quite match the experience you would get if you held the print in your hand. I am trying to share paper selection and my thought process behind the papers that I'm choosing. This is just a close-up. You can see how there's no loss of detail whatsoever, even on a matte paper. The BFK Reeves has a slight texture to it, but even with that texture, which is basically little differences in the surface of the paper, the texture comes across really, really nicely. And you can see, if you look carefully, the texture in the white of the paper there on the bottom left. It's a very nice, not random, but not perfectly even texture. Okay, here's another image. This is the original. This is, again, nothing out of the ordinary. Canon 105 millimeters, f8, once again. I did this was done at ISO 800 because I was handheld, and so I wanted to make sure that I had a nice sharp capture. And I might have been also in kind of a rush, and so I didn't have time to really look at all the controls of the camera. ISO 800 is okay, particularly on an image like this where there is a lot of detail, there's a lot of texture, if you will, in the image, and so any noise there really isn't going to be something that I need to worry about, unlike if it was in a smooth surface. And again, f8 to really get as much of the crispness of the lens as I can, the detail of the lens, without having to add too much sharpening later on. And again, this comes from just my experience printing, where I find that the prints that look the best are the ones where things are best from the beginning, from the capture, versus having to do lots of things in the editing. And this is the finished version. Again, you notice that I went from color to black and white. That wasn't something that I thought about originally. It was just something that happened. I felt that the image in black and white represented more of kind of the energy of the light coming at me. There's a backlit scene. It made the graphical elements, the rhythm of the trees, much more apparent, much more easier to see. It made that the focus, right? It's kind of how these trees are all kind of moving rhythmically between each other, how your eye kind of plays around. And then there's that front to back element of the light and the shadows in the foreground. I printed this on a newer paper from Canson called Arch 88. If any of you are familiar with Canson's papers, I would have printed this before on something like a rag photographique, something that perhaps didn't have a lot of texture, but Arch 88 is a paper like rag photographique, except I think I would say that it has a little bit more Dmax. It holds a tiny bit more black, and it has a wonderfully smooth surface. It's a tiny, tiny bit wider than rag photographique. I really like this paper a lot, and you can see that even with a black and white image, it brings across all of the blacks and the shadows that I need for this image. I don't need it to be any louder than that. Again, for me, for the kind of impression that I'm trying to create, this is exactly what I'm looking for. Just enough black to create enough separation, to create enough variation in the image, but not too much to make it too heavy, too loud, too in your face, so to speak. And again, you can see perhaps the surface is very, very smooth, and there's no lack of texture in the image. It's very, very, very detailed. Here's another image. This is, again, nothing out of the ordinary. F14 to get depth of field. Here I'm thinking about that rock in the foreground, the bottom left, to be sharp, as well as the rocks that lead up through the lake, and then the distant mountains in the back. So I needed enough depth of field to really make sure that I could capture all of that relatively sharply. 1/25 of a second, and this is at 32 millimeters. So I tend to hover around some of those other images at 24, 32. I like this range because it's not too wide. It allows me to simplify images down, but also it's wide enough to create a lot of depth, right? I can really emphasize the foreground and create that sense of separation. Again, it's very easy with super wide angle lenses like 14, 16, 18 to exaggerate not only the foreground, but to push things in the distance, way into the distance. And I personally from a compositional standpoint, wanted to make a connection between the foreground and the background. And that's the edited version. You can see that I have done quite a bit to accentuate that connection between the boulders and also the boulders that are under the water. So for me, that's what makes this image interesting for me, is that I'm using different elements, some that are softer, some that are harder. Again, the ones under the water and above the water sort of create a nice variation there. And you want to keep going between the two, particularly those three in the bottom. And then bringing out more of the sky in the background. Again, this is the original. And then here, I really wanted to get that connection all the way up to the sky with just a little bit of those clouds. So this is a great example where I want a paper that has a relatively high amount of Dmax, but certainly no texture whatsoever. And the reason for no texture is because I want to preserve the textural differences between the things in the image that have texture and don't have texture. So, you know, one of the compositional elements of the image is that the rocks are floating in the water, so to speak. They're not floating, but there's that difference there. The rocks have texture, the water is very, very, very smooth. If I use a paper that has texture, then I'm adding texture to the rocks and the water and the sky. And what I'm doing in that case is that I am diminishing the textural variation in the print. If I use a paper that doesn't have any texture, then I'm preserving the textural differences in the print. Now, as I mentioned before, I probably would have gone to something like Baryta for an image like this, but Canson has a new paper that they introduced recently called Baryta Photographique 2 Matte. Now, the matte is what's interesting. They have a Baryta paper that has a matte finish, but the surface has a higher amount or higher Dmax rating than a normal matte paper would. So it's kind of like if you took a Baryta paper, and you sort of polished the surface until it got kind of dull, like a matte paper. And this paper is really, for me, it's really amazing because it gives me the feel of a matte paper, the look and feel. It's dull like a matte paper. It doesn't have that sheen and it has more of an organic look to it. However, it's super smooth and it really preserves blacks incredibly well. And so you kind of get the best of both worlds. You get the sort of the more of the painterly look of a matte paper, but you don't lose any in terms of the blacks and the shadows, particularly in this image in the bottom left, where I've got lots of little subtle shadow areas that I want to preserve and I want to maintain that separation. So again, that's Baryta Photographique 2 Matte. There used to be a Baryta Photographique, and then that was replaced by a Baryta Photographique 2, which is your traditional Baryta paper, then this matte version, which is new. Right, and then this image here is, again, nothing out of the ordinary, no filters here. This is 1/80th of a second at f8. f8, because I'm using an Olympus camera, and Olympus camera has a smaller sensor, and so it automatically gives you more depth of field than I would get in a 35mm sensor, for example. And notice that even though the sky looks blown out, I'm very carefully monitoring or very carefully checked my histogram to make sure that I wasn't clipping the highlights, because I knew that if I could maintain the highlights, then I could recover those, or I would have them in the file to then manipulate into something that looked much more realistic and more like what I saw. And this is the edited version. You notice that the sky I've now brought into play in the image, if you will. Here, the sky is completely blown out, but the tones were there because I'm very careful with the histogram. And then again, I'm using sort of that compositional interaction between the bigger rocks in the foreground, then smaller rocks in the middle, then bigger rocks in the middle ground, and then back into the background. So the composition is where I start. That's kind of what I'm thinking about first. And then if the composition works, then I know that I have a good chance of making a print that might, capture someone's imagination or capture someone's interest at the very least. And once again, I went to Baryta Photographique Matte for this. This would have been an image that I would have used something like Platine, for example, because Platine has a tiny bit of texture compared to Baryta, and Platine also has that amazing density, which is great for images where you have a lot of black. However, having this Baryta matte paper, I decided to try and see what, how it would hold up or how it would complement the image, and I was very happy with the results, particularly that rock in the foreground with the water. That has to be, you need more contrast to get that sense of wetness, and this paper does that really well. And again, this is a photograph of a print, but if you try this paper and you print yourself, you'll see what I'm talking about. You really appreciate an amazing job that Canson has done with this paper to give us, Dmax levels approaching, a paper like Baryta, but with a matte finish, which is really fantastic, I think. So some final thoughts, right? First is, respect your voice, right? Don't, seek authenticity, right? What is it that you want to say? Stick to what you enjoy, what motivates you. It's easy to get wrapped up in what photo clubs want, or what, the market wants, or what Instagram wants, but that's not going to keep you going for long. And it's certainly not going to allow you to kind of feel like you're doing something that speaks to you. You can only do something that speaks to someone else when it speaks to you first. Second is focus on the composition. Composition is the most important element of a successful print. That's been my experience and the experience of every other print that I've ever looked at. You love the print, but boy, the image is just fantastic, and the print just takes it to another level for images that really work well. And the fundamentals is where everything starts, and you cannot go wrong with returning to the fundamentals over and over again, right? Don't let the technique and the software, get ahead of you, kind of throw you off track. It's too easy these days to get lost in terms of all the different choices that we have and all the marketing forces and all of the options, and really it doesn't really get you any closer to the reality that it's the fundamentals is what really is going to speak to someone else. So again, break down what you're trying to learn into basic building blocks that allow you to gain mastery at the core level. As I mentioned before, the guiding principles, right? Start with your vision, then focus on how to translate that vision into the language of photography, which is composition. Then once you have the capture, then you continue that same process into the developing stage. The developing stage is just another step in this, in the process of going from vision to the composition. Now you're developing it, and the developing is guided by your vision. And then finally, the print itself, right? Learning, of course, the technicalities of printing, not something that I can cover here, but that's something that you can learn. You can learn to make technically proper image, particularly with powerful software like Lightroom. It's the emotional content that's going to be harder, but also I would say much more satisfying. And that's what really, what really matters, I think. And that's probably the biggest challenge for all of us today, including myself, right? Making sure that we're paying attention to what really matters, what we think matters, and not what someone else thinks matters. So if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer some questions. I know I've covered a lot today. I don't see any questions, but if all of you understood that, then that's great. I'm thinking of, oh, well, great, thank you. Thank you, Craig. How do you decide on print size? That's an excellent question. And I would say there's a couple of factors that I use for determining print size. So for example, for me, most of my work tends to be landscapes and things that are fairly intricate. In terms of selling my work, I never sell 8.5 by 11. I don't think that 8.5 by 11 represents what I'm trying to capture in the image. It's too small. It doesn't necessarily convey the grandeur of what I'm trying to convey. So I tend not to go too small. As far as the size after that, right, 11 by 17 is nice for me. I think that's a nice print. 13 by 19 is even nicer. Again, I'm talking about my taste or my choice. In fact, I'd say bigger, generally speaking, could be better. Print size, I think, should be based on probably one, your budget, what you can afford in paper. 8.5 by 11 is a great sort of sampling size. I just don't think you really get the impression, the feel of a print unless you're doing 11 by 17. So for me, when I'm testing my work, when I'm testing prints, when I'm doing samples, it's always 11 by 17. 13 by 19 is a nice sweet spot. And then after that, if you're not printing for yourself and you're printing for others, well, then you've got some choices there, because if you're selling or what have you, then they'll dictate what size they would like. In all my years of selling photography at galleries and art shows and so forth, for me, the popular print size has probably been around 20 by 30. That tends to be a pretty good size that people feel that, it takes up a nice space in their living room or their bedroom or what have you. Smaller sizes, also fairly popular, but if you've got a nice landscape of, a beautiful lake or a forest scene or what have you, a 20 by 30 is really nice. And, if you need to make a 20 by 30 print and you don't have access to a printer, there are Canson certified labs that will print the work for you, which is nice because that means you can get someone who understands what you're trying to achieve, versus, let's say, one of the outlet stores where you may not get the quality that you're looking for. Yes, it is being recorded, so you'll have access to it. I believe Canson will send you a link afterwards so you can watch it later. All right. Let's see, any other questions? How do I scroll through this? Yeah, what do you suggest for high contrast black and white images that are basically a white high tone with more of an abstract design quality of the image? Well, that's kind of a tough question, because I'm not looking at the image. But if your first part of your question is what do you suggest for a high contrast black and white, if you in your mind you're thinking that you want something that's going to maintain that high contrast, I would say start with Baryta, because the nice thing about Baryta is Baryta Photographic 2, it's got really good contrast, the highest contrast that you're going to get in any paper from Canson, and it also doesn't have any texture. It's going to be very smooth, and so you start with that. No texture means you don't have to worry about how that's going to impact your image. And if you find that you may want something with a slight amount of surface interest, then something like Platine would be your second best choice. So the difference between Baryta and Platine, generally speaking, is that Platine has a slight irregularity to the surface. I hesitate to call it texture, but there is something happening on the surface that gives it a little bit of a dimension versus Baryta, which is very smooth. So that's what I would suggest there. All right, I don't see any other questions. Oh, okay. How do you decide the resolution of an image to print? So that's a kind of a technical question. I will answer in a very short, abbreviated way, but if you want more information on this is probably something that you need to do a little research on. Resolution, the way I print all of my images, and I've been teaching how to print images to everyone that's come through my printing workshops, and they've all had good results. Everyone has always had good results with this method, is that I use the native resolution of the printer that I'm using. So if you're using a Canon printer, the native resolution is 300 PPI. If you're using an Epson printer, the native resolution is 360 PPI, not DPI, PPI. So again, not enough time to explain the differences, but the resolution is the resolution of your image. And I use the native resolution of the printer because regardless of what resolution you send to your printer, it has to interpolate that image to be able to get it to the native resolution of the printer's print head. If it's Epson, that's 360 PPI. And so instead of letting the printer do that interpolation, I suggest doing that in Lightroom and having Lightroom interpolate the image to the printer's native resolution. So whatever image I'm printing, whatever image I'm sending to my Canon printer, in the Lightroom print dialog, there's a little checkbox where you can say interpolate, and you can then interpolate that image to the native resolution of the Canon, which in this case would be 300. And that's how I kind of solve that problem. Again, I'm being very general here. I'm not giving you specifics. There are a lot of little specific points to this, but I'm just giving you an overview of this. This assumes that your image is of high enough quality to print at the size you want to print at, right? So if you've got a 20 megapixel image, you're not trying to make a print that's 40 by 60, or if you've got a 4 megapixel image, you're not trying to make a print that is 13 by 19 because there's not enough resolution there. But any modern camera, 14, 16 megapixels and up, you'll be able to print using this method, interpolating to the native resolution of the printer, and get fantastic results. Let's see, is anyone else here? Any other questions? Yeah, so I think that's it for questions. The last thing here is that Canon has graciously will provide you with two sheet sample pack of any of the papers that you want to try. That's the link that you need to go to in order to register and fill out the form with your address to get these papers. So if you want to try 2 sheets of any of these papers, I don't think you'll get them all, but if you want to try any of them, that's the URL, right? tinyurl.com/Canson Infinity, and you can request to get 2 sheets of this paper sent to you. I don't know, I know that it's not available around the world, but I'm pretty sure, if I remember correctly, it's the US and Canada, and I believe Canada, and several countries in Europe, probably the countries of the EU and also the UK. So yeah, give that a shot. If I were, choosing these papers, I think that probably the Baryta Photographique 2 Matte is going to be the most interesting of this bunch, because for the reasons that I mentioned before. If you're looking for a more traditional matte paper, then the BFK or the Arch 88 are amazing. I think the Arch Aquarelle is more of a limited use, because the Arch Aquarelle has the heaviest texture of any of Canson's papers. And so unless you know that you want a lot of texture and it's going to work with your image, then that might not be a paper that you would use often. I rarely ever use Aquarelle. But Arch 88, no texture. BFK Reeves has just a subtle, beautiful texture. Baryta Prestige is the high density paper. So if you know you want high density, you like that surface, and you like Baryta, then that's a great paper. And then the Photographique Matte is this hybrid paper, which I think is outstanding. Okay, so tinyurl.com/Canson Infinity. Finally, if you want to read my blog, you want to connect with me, you want to subscribe to my newsletter, which I share creative resources and information, and I also do offer free webinars on a regular basis, which you can also join for free. You would get that through my newsletter. You can sign up at creativepathworkshops.com, and if you want to see more of my work, my personal website is robertrodriguezjr.com. All right, so thank you for joining me tonight. Good luck in your printing, and I will see you next time. Good luck. Good night.